the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, do you want to mention we have a Patreon account, which you can locate at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. We have made our Discord server available. We are hosting some reading groups. That content's being put on Patreon. And Taylor, I believe you've actually been putting the recordings on the free tier. Is that right?
Yes, free tier. So if you want access to the Discord, if you want to join up and you can't spare $1 a month, which we understand, times are tight, then you're still able to join on the free tier. You can participate in the reading groups. We just started a new one.
Well,
today.
I think you'd need access to the. I don't think that Discord access is on the free level, but the material is available.
X that since I'm lying. I'm lying. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying ears? And we just started a new reading group today covering Jeremy Smith's translation of Laurel's Theory of Strangers. And so that's going to be going on for the next few months. And then afterwards, we're going to start Guattari's schizoanalytic cartographies. So we've kind of blocked out the next few months and more for those reading groups. Exciting times. Come and join us.
So today we're going to be having a look primarily at chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Moishe Postone's Time, Labor, and Social Domination. I do want to, preface that I think Postone is very close to what I'm doing, or what we're doing rather, in terms of the book project. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be like bouncing Postone off of some of our favorites. So just to acquaint listeners with kind of the direction we're taking so they're not disappointed that this is not going to be like necessarily a deep dive focus on what Postone is doing specifically and entirely. We're going to weave this into a lot of the threads that we've been discussing for some time, including the book project that is forthcoming. So generally,
listeners, if you're a new time listener, you can learn a little bit about our method, our process. Listeners of the show will probably be already familiar with the fact that we use each text as an occasion for thinking and not necessarily for an occasion for explicating. And so it's a slightly different vibe we have on during the happy hour. We're always using the text as a springboard, right? As a trampoline. And so, yeah, in that spirit, we're just going to keep, this isn't all that different from what we normally do, I would say, right? And so, although depending on the text, we might dive deeper. This one, we may be a little bit, it's an occasion for thinking. And that also means it's an occasion to revisit at some other time. But it's still a productive use. And I think that's the positive thing. And that's what, Deleuze and Guattari say about Anti-Oedipus. You don't read it just to understand it. You need to experiment with it, do something with it.
The first thing I want to do is open up the episode with what I will consider the epigraph for the episode. And this is going to be from William Wordsworth's poem, The World is Too Much With Us. Because I think this just really, before bed last night, I just had this idea. I thought of this poem. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. I think in retrospect that the power of this poem is going to really it'll manifest itself later. Once you've listened to the entire episode, you can reflect on these words, and I think you'll really get why I included that.
That's a word I don't use in everyday language, is sordid.
Right.
That's a word that I should try to throw in just like randomly, right? Just like bring it in out of nowhere.
I love doing that kind of stuff. throwing in some anachronistic terminology. That's kind of always been one of my favorite little gags to run.
From
Bits.
Latin sordidus, so it has to do with filth, dirt. That's what I thought, but I didn't know it was literally etymologically dirty. But yeah,
that's cool. Maybe up front, even to contextualize this, the world is too much with us. So one of the things that I want to discuss is what is ontologically primary is surplus and not lack. And so that's kind of building on Guattari, right? And the solar economy, the sun gives us more energy than any systems on the earth or whatever can absorb and mobilize for productive capacity, right? So the problem for economies isn't going to be scarcity as we're kind of told, so to speak, but it's excess. The world is overproduced, actually. We work too much. Hence, the world is too much with us.
I thought about us today and just like what we were reading, because randomly on Twitter, I saw someone saying, there's a footnote in Rousseau's book on music where it was in The Origin of Language, maybe a little footnote where Rousseau's like, nothing is greater than the desire to do nothing. And it's like, it's the whole communism is free time.
Yeah. Wait,
kind of vibe.
Hey, did Rousseau write Candide? Or
that's
am I fucking
Voltaire.
that up? That's Voltaire. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. All right. I'm fucking up my French.
Yeah, the 18th century French guys. How dare you mix them up? It makes sense why you might. They were two of the greatest luminaries of the 19th century in France. So it makes sense that you would.
I mean, this was going to come up later in the discussion, but I think capitalism is a theodicy in the sense that minus the transcendent God, but not necessarily that far from the sort of invisible hand of providence, the invisible hand of the market that directs everything and makes it look like there is harmony within the world, right? The best of all possible worlds is what the market delivers as sort of an ideological cover. That's why I was thinking about Candide. But back to the Wordsworth poem. So the next line's getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. So this is getting to the MCM circuit that Marx discusses in Capital.
I like to call it MCM prime.
Right. Yeah, that's probably...
The prime is the surplus. So money, commodities, surplus money, if you want to call it that. Obviously, the surplus being the constitutional capital. But yeah, MCM prime, baby.
Our powers, our lives, our labor power, etc., are what's sort of being wasted. There's also the kind of gift, the free gift, I think, is how Postone refers to it in the book, as far as not only like social knowledge and dead labor as like accumulated capacity, I suppose, but also like in the trans-individual sort of ground for, this goes really to Marx in the sense that whenever laborers come together, what they produce, or there's a surplus that emerges from it's an emergent part of the process that can only be developed in the social relation of labor. There's like a product that exceeds, like if you took the individual pieces of labor, the individual atomized laborers, when you combine them in a social relation, they produce more than they would have as these individual units. And capital not only gets a free ride on the historical accumulation of capital, but also this sociality sort of part of it, which also gets compounded. But I don't think, when I first started the book, I was only thinking about dead labor in a more kind of linear sense, where, basically I wasn't considering that sort of emergent aspect of productivity or surplus, or I don't even know how to necessarily describe it at this juncture, but that extra value that comes through the sociality of the labor process, capital gets to appropriate that too. So it's not only just, capital comes in at the sort of, not the end of history, but at a later point of development when we've already developed writing and mathematics and like all of these other kind of basic infrastructure that allows capital to function, if that makes sense. Next line, little we see in nature that is ours. The value form, which is really a big part of what Postone's critique relates to with respect to, I guess, more orthodox Marxian philosophy or political economy. because he's a value form guy, which I think to me makes a lot of sense. The way that he situates the argument in the book itself, I think it's pretty convincing for me. That dead labor, even nature, I suppose, too, all of these kind of elements that are sort of excluded from the value formation. There's an abstraction that become like it's kind of like this blind spot. It's this papering over. So we don't see, kind of like, I guess really this would go to Marx's quote about, what is it, like, men make the world, but we don't understand that we make the world. I forget. Do you know what I'm talking about? I fucked that up.
We are definitely not the authors of the conditions under which we.
I have to Google this.
Yeah, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. So that's the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte.
What's obscured is the fact that we make the world through our labor, right? Because I think
but the conditions are determined, right? So it's kind of a fun agency determinism type beat. Anyways,
I'm spending too much time on this, but
no, you're good.
Last line: we have given our hearts away, a sordid boon, a gift that's also simultaneously a degradation.
What is a gift? Not a gift.
Right. That trans-individual surplus that we surrender to capital as that free gift, the living labor given over to the dead, the concrete sacrifice to the abstract. It's a boon in the sense that it generates a productive power, but sordid because it's what's actually stolen from us.
We may not be explicating Postone, but we are definitely explicating motherfucking Wordsworth today. So
it's all going to be a theodicy in a sense, right? It's all going to weave there's going to be a divine harmony throughout the episode as it unfolds. So just stay with me. So one thing I was thinking about whenever I was reading Postone was, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Taylor, but the audience may know this Milton Friedman. It's like a poem or it's like a little essay called I Pencil. Are you aware of this at all?
I'm not familiar, but I'm reading I saw it in your notes and I'm reading over it again. And it sounds like something he would say.
I'll put a link to, I think there's a PDF of the essay itself. And then I know I've seen a video of him talking about it. So I remember someone posted this video of him talking about the pencil on Twitter a while back. And I remember thinking, holy shit, what he's kind of pointing to about this kind of organizing principle of the market is fundamentally made possible by abstract labor time. Abstract labor time is what enables all of these heterogeneous components of labor and knowledge and activity to be formalized into a general equivalent with one another so they can all sort of be exchanged on a marketplace. To get back to his example, he marvels at the manufacturing of the pencil because there's like a huge amount of people involved in production of the pencil, yet none of these individual laborers themselves understands how to make the pencil. And he kind of refers to this as a miracle because, again, it's like this sort of self-organizing principle, which he attributes to the market, but is enabled by this like domination of not only abstract labor, but this also gets into the hylomorphic schema, which I'll tap into a little bit later, but just to flag that for you and the audience. Just to give this concrete examples, right? Because when you're thinking about the construction of the pencil, we might have a lumberjack, we might have a graphite miner, etc. They're heterogeneous in their different skill sets, different bodies, rhythms of work, different types of knowledge. All of this qualitative difference gets smashed down into quantitative universalism. And that only becomes exchangeable through wages, which basically translate into the quantity of an abstract time, which can be exchanged for money. So abstract labor time would be something like a social form through which different labor or types of labor relate to each other, all under maybe say the axiomatic of value, which without that, there wouldn't be any exchange, any price signal. Because I think that's one of the underlying assumptions that Friedman is making as far as the price signal is, that's the informational component, right? Because this is like going towards this critique of central planning, right? Because it goes back to Hayek and the calculation problem where because labor is social, which it's kind of funny that they like disavow, they like repress the social aspect of labor
Right.
in a way, right? So yeah, no one individual person, to Friedman's point, right? No individual person knows how to make the pencil. It's seemingly this invisible hand of the market via price signals that are directing activity. We can concede the point, yes, that no particular individual would be able to coordinate that activity. We can probably maybe even cede ground in terms of the calculation problem being a genuine problem without necessarily ceding the ground of the kind of dark mechanism of abstract labor and the value form itself. Because Friedman's price signal is abstract labor time expressed in money. When he's claiming that the price is directing the lumberjack. When he's saying that the price is directing the lumberjack in terms of what to do, labor time is what's imposing a temporality like a universal temporality on his concrete qualitative activity. It's not as though he's freely responding to this information. He's being sort of compelled by this process, like this temporal standard, right? The abstract labor time. The pencil's affordability doesn't reflect some type of miraculous efficiency. It's about the compression of the abstract labor hour through competition. Every producer has to meet or exceed the socially necessary labor time for that product. And the really like dark part, this norm, this kind of floor level resets itself every time there's a productivity increase. Let's say there's a new technology that emerges in the production sphere. For a time, that whatever company or what have you, or individual, yada, yada, develops the new technology. For a time, there's an advantage to them. But then what happens is that advantage becomes the new floor, and that's through competition on the market, right? Everybody has to upgrade their equipment, and then that advantage that was gained is lost. The pencil only costs a few cents because that temporal aspect of abstract labor time is never reset. So it's kind of like productivity goes up. For example, now as a society, as a civilization, we're more productive than we were in 1850, right? We get more work done in an hour than we did then, but the standard of the labor hour, of the abstract labor hour by which value is measured, hasn't changed. We're stuffing more and more and more productivity into an hour, but the hour never changes. We produce more material wealth. Material wealth's gone up, but the need for labor hasn't gone away, right? Because I think even Keynes, Maynard Keynes, right, thought we'd be working like something like 30% of what we do now. I forget what the specific measure was, but the promise is always, technology will liberate us from labor, but we see that never actually materializes in practice, which is a big part of what Postone's book is articulating. He calls it the treadmill. I think even our friend Thomas Nail kind of got at this when he called capitalism an ontological swindle because of what the demarcation of what is considered value. What Friedman's argument is dependent on is something that it can't actually acknowledge, which would be the spontaneous order he's describing is a specific form of social domination. It appears as freedom because no identifiable person is exercising power. I don't know if listeners will recall this, but I've often said that the market is simply a mechanism of dispersed sovereignty. So there's no particular, I guess that might be, what is it, the despotic territorial machine, where the despot kind of overcodes everything.
But now the despot is injected all throughout. That's decoding.
Exactly. So domination is exercised by the form itself, by the fact that social wealth is measured in abstract labor time rather than in concrete use value or material wealth. So this is Postone's biggest point here. If you measure wealth in terms of material output, use values, the coordination problem that Friedman is talking about, it might exist, but it doesn't exist in the same way. The different concrete labor hours producing different things wouldn't need to be rendered equivalent. This apparatus of price signals, market coordination, and the alleged miracle of the pencil is already presupposing a social form that measures its wealth through the expenditure of abstract labor time rather than by what gets produced. Ultimately, that means the pencil argument doesn't describe this natural feature of contemporary economies. It describes this historically contingent social form and mistakes it for human nature. To me, what also emerged is really interesting about this, which I'll get to later, is how this actually goes to Baudrillard, surprisingly, and it gives a little bit of more like theoretical grounding for what Baudrillard says about hyperreality. Abstract labor time, right? It's right there in the name. Abstract labor time is already pointing towards simulation in a sense. To sharpen that, going back to how I was discussing the measure of the abstract hour stays the same, but the amount of productivity that occurs within that hour goes up. That differential, that is where things get kind of screwy in terms of semiotic production, right? Because again, hyperreality, which I think is easy to think about as a lack of reality, but it's not. It's the overproduction of reality. Yes. And so you start to see how the overproduction of not only in the material sphere, but like in the semiotic sphere, it follows this same trajectory.
That's very evident just by like quickly glancing at social media, for example. It's just a hyper glut of quote unquote meaning. But even like when Deleuze and Guattari talk about the signifier, how it's just redundancy of redundancy, right? In that sense, it's not at all a lack. It's a glut, right? It's a gluttony of signification. And that's partly why it's part of the determination of the body without organs. Signifier, subject, organism.
You know, I opened the episode with the world being too much with us. And it's, again, this imposed scarcity when there's really, the problem isn't scarcity. The real problem is that we have surplus. I mean, there's a number of different ways. And I was going to get to this later on, but since I'm already here, I'll go through it now. One way this manifests itself is whenever the central bank, like the Fed, creates money, they create more money. There's more loans made out that can ever be repaid. They loan out money, but what they don't loan out is the interest on that money. So structurally, we have already, so it's not that there's not enough, there's too much already at the beginning. At the kind of like macro level, there is surplus, but at the individual level, there is lack because you don't have the money to pay back the loan. It gets really interesting, I think, ontologically speaking, and as a like springboard between Lacan and Deleuze and Guattari, and like where Lacan is kind of like onto something, but not fully. We'll get to that in a bit. Back to Friedman and hylomorphism. His position is from the master, or I forget what the terminology is.
Yeah, the master, the boss, the whoever, yeah.
Whoever is directing production. That's his perspective. All of the sort of credit for who produces or who directs production is centered on this figure of the capitalist. But as we know from Simondon, if we go back to the hylomorphic schema and about matter already sort of having its self-organizational properties, or matter is not sort of inert. It has potential already built within it for self-organization.
It has implicit forms as well. What he calls implicit forms.
The market doesn't coordinate knowledge. It coordinates this already abstracted labor. The heterogeneous knowledge of the lumberjack, the lacquerer, what the lumberjack knows about trees, what the lacquerer knows about chemistry, is consumed in that process and doesn't actually appear in the price. Price isn't signaling all of the information that Friedman kind of claims. Points back to abstract labor time being the hylomorphic operation applied to labor. It's extracting this formal dimension, so commensurable quantities of time, and discarding the material portion, so the skill, the knowledge, the bodily expenditure, and the pencil's ultimate price is only registering the form. The matter itself is classified as valueless by the same schema that the coordination is considered to be a miracle, as Friedman says, right?
It's a miracle in the sense, specifically in the sense you brought up with Simondon, and he's showing how the hylomorphic schema arises out of a certain social form. It's a social form of production, and the form imposing itself in its activity in the hylomorphic schema's point of view is, of course, the one giving the orders is going to take what goes on in the workshop and comes out of it, or what goes in and what goes out. That's what he sees, right? He sees the materials going in, he sees the product leaving the workshop. There's a dark zone or an obscure zone, if you want to be more literal, that the hylomorphic schema leaves in darkness for us. We don't see what's actually going on within the workshop when we are from the perspective of those who are giving orders. And so, yeah, of course, it's a miracle. It's a miracle when we abstract away from the interactive process that's actually going on in that dark zone. So from the perspective of form, or even from the perspective of matter, without the interactive institution of internal resonance and establishing it and following it through the entire process, it becomes less of a miracle insofar as when David Hume speaks about miracles, he postulates that any miracle given future understanding then becomes, in the light of day, a little bit more banal. It's enough to be able to shed some light on this dark zone that the miracle dissipates into the actual real process underway.
I'm going to read this quote. This is from Postone, but he's citing Marx in volume 1 of Capital. And the context is sort of Marx describing large-scale industry. Man has succeeded in making the product of his past labor perform gratuitous service on a large scale like a force of nature, which goes directly to this critique of Milton Friedman that we've been working through. The trans-individual surplus, that social dimension of labor, is the free gift to capital. It's not paid for because it doesn't exist at the point of purchase. It only emerges in the combination, and the combination is organized under capital's authority. So back to the hylomorphic schema, right? So science, cooperation, accumulated knowledge of the species, all of this doesn't cost capital anything because it's already been historically constituted. Capital isn't paying a license to the fucking ancient Sumerians for writing or ledgers or like mathematics or shit like that, right? It gets all of that historical labor and knowledge and scientific infrastructure for free. And then it asserts itself as the cause.
This is obviously important for the current pushback against Gen AI, the slop that we are seeing. It's taken as givens as a part of its matrix. All of these, we could say the transcendental condition of possibility of Gen AI. It's all of the art that it's churned through, and then it literally shits out an amalgamation of what's been fed into it and takes it as it's not factored into the cost. All of the IPs that you would have to pay for would dwarf like the GDPs of most countries. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off topic. It just felt relevant for a moment.
No, it definitely does. I mean, it points to the same process of appropriation, the theft that underlies capital.
It's a sordid boon.
It's a sordid boon. Yeah, exactly.
It's a
right?
fucking sordid boon.
Okay, so here's what you're going to you might find interesting, and definitely feel free to correct me if I'm fucking anything up with respect to Simondon. So I want to take Simondon and Marx and build this political economical synthesis between the two. So the emergent surplus, let's say, that Marx discusses would be kind of akin to what Simondon would refer to as a process of trans-individuation. So individuation is occurring at a level that's beyond the individual, but it constitutes a collective that's irreducible to the sum of those parts. So this goes back to my labor example, right? It's whenever the value that gets produced in the social process of labor exceeds the potential even of any of those given laborers individual. So it's not like we're adding 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. It's like 1 + 1 + 1 = 6, for example. So you get actually more productivity out of the workers than you would on a sort of individual basis of just a simple addition, like a linear addition. It's almost, I don't know if it would be exponential, but the like surplus somehow exceeds the individuals. So what capital is doing is capturing the trans-individual dimension, so the collective social dimension, formalizes it, and then embeds it in technical objects. So I don't know, that might be a spot for you to intervene if you want to.
Yeah, I do think that there are, for example, let's see, this is, I'm kind of glossing something that Simondon says towards the end of his book on the mode of existence of technical objects. He says, we should discover a social and economic mode where the user of the technical object would be not only the owner of the machine, but also the person who chooses it and maintains it. The basis of norms and laws in the industrial realm is neither work nor property, but technicity. Communication should go towards the technical activity, not through values of work of economic criteria. Social conditions and economic factors cannot be harmonized since they belong to different worlds. They can find mediation only through a technically dominated organization. This level of technical organization where the human meets the human, not as a member of a class, but as a being that expresses itself through the technical object, which is homogeneous to its activity, is the level of collective that goes beyond interindividuality and a given social order. So
brilliant. That's perfect.
That's kind of why Simondon doesn't want us to reduce trans individuality, which is obviously very close to what Marx and Postone are talking about with collectivization, with collective. That's another adjective Simondon uses for trans individual, by the way. Collective doesn't mean interindividual. Interindividual, sure, there is interindividual reality and dialogue and things like this, but the dialogue obviously doesn't stop or start even with the two interlocutors. There is a whole field of semiotic and linguistic, historical, with all these dimensions that go behind the backs and over the heads of two speakers. And I do think that there is a lot, or there is not, maybe not a lot, but there is a decent amount of literature in various languages, English, French, Spanish. I just did like a quick search working over Simondon and Marx. And it's a fruitful field to explore, as can be seen, or as we discussed in our episode, where we discuss hylomorphism more directly, Simondon goes up to this critique that would get him on Marxist grounds very easily, but that's not, he doesn't have the same problems, right? And that's fine, right? He's doing something. Bergson does interesting things too here, where he gets like right up to the threshold of a kind of socialist Marxist critique when he thinks about language. He sounds very Deleuze Guattarian, except they are explicitly Marxist. But when Bergson's like, look, language is oriented towards activity. It's oriented towards getting things done. In that sense, Bergson obviously has a trans-individual collective view of language, and a sense that could, as I said, it gets him to the threshold of a Marxist critique of language or something like this, right? And I think that Deleuze Guattari in the postulates of linguistics, for example, and when Guattari takes up what he's calling pragmatics and saying, look, it's not a fucking wastebasket, as Chomsky says, it's the socially dynamic living force of language. And to cut that out because you think science needs a homogeneous object, and this is Saussure too. Saussure is like, language is a heterogeneous reality, but we can't study that. And Guattari's not going to be, as a militant and as an analyst, he's saying you left out the good shit. Like what are we doing?
Yeah, you made me think about the concept of the abstract machine there, the abstract machine of language, but also like the abstract machine of, I don't know how that works as far as production, or like abstract labor time and necessarily if that kind of fits into that dynamic. But
well, I do think that Postone in reviewing and reinterpreting Marx is trying to locate something like he's trying to outline, center in on is a better way of saying he's trying to home in on the abstract machine of capital. Deleuze and Guattari do this as well, and Anti-Oedipus, obviously, but more specifically in Apparatus of Capture, for example, which we discussed with Eugene Holland, where they're looking quite particularly at what goes into constituting the abstract machine of capital. And that obviously is why they articulate a new understanding of what they're calling the axiomatic. Because if the primitive territorial machine and the despotic imperial machine are working with codes and overcoding, when we get to part of the dynamics of capitalism and we're dealing with decoded flows, then that's when we're dealing with what they call the axiomatic. And that's why they spend so much time working on it and working through it. That could be something too that we could revisit. I'm sure that there's obviously throughout 1,000 plateaus, but that plateau in particular, that 13th plateau, I think would have some fertile ground, at least as a footnote to some of what you've cooked up, my brother.
I can't remember what they say specifically with respect to the capitalist axiomatics and even what Holland says, because what I kind of interpret Postone, like I mentioned earlier, it's like the axiomatic of value itself is kind of like what he points to without declaring it in those terms. But I think he definitely suggests as well, I think he aligns with Deleuze and Guattari a lot more readily than you might assume, even though he's more explicitly, I think. I mean, he's post-Marxist, but he's not, I don't think he's quite the same degree of post-Marxist as Deleuze and Guattari would be. But like, you can already see, I think, in that process of the technical innovation and the resetting of the floor of production. So what I was talking about earlier, where some company comes up with a new technical innovation. For a time, they yield a productive advantage, but then through competition on the market with other firms, that advantage gets distributed across all producers, and the requirement to innovate again reasserts itself. So you can see the process of deterritorialization, reterritorialization. There's no Hegelian moment of sublation that occurs. And that I think that's ironically one of the things I thought was kind of amusing about Postone is he still like uses this dialectical language whenever he's working through these issues, but he is already pointing towards the fact that there's no sublation at play. I think this is where the transductive method of Simondon becomes more operative and is the methodology that we want to really use in the book, I think, or at least that's kind of like what I'm trying to do. And I think interestingly, and I'll get to this as well, is taking the transductive methodology, like running Lacan through a transductive method yields some pretty interesting results, I think, with respect to lack and surplus and like objet A. But I'll get there or try to get there before the end of the episode. Just want to pause there and see if you have anything to respond to.
There was something
like the axiomatic stuff, because I wasn't sure. I don't remember if they. I don't think even Holland mentioned something about axiomatic of value specifically. But
well, okay. So axiology is the study of values. Rie writes about that, for example. He's always concerned with the axiological. But in terms of the axiomatic, for example, I just randomly flipped to page 144. This is the 5th plateau on several regimes of signs. They say, it is not enough to say that axiomatics does not take invention and creation into account. It possesses a deliberate will to halt or stabilize the diagram, to take its place by lodging itself on a level of coagulated abstraction too large for the concrete, but too small for the real. We will see in what sense this is the quote-unquote capitalist level. I liked this coagulated abstraction too large for the concrete, but too small for the real. I thought that was...
I mean, does that tie on to that kind of the emergent thing that Marx is bringing up as far as production, where, again, it's like there's a surplus that exceeds even the linear mathematics of 1 + 1 equaling 2 whenever we get two laborers together, right? I mean, it's also interesting, I think, too, because they mentioned diagram right there. I was thinking about the factory itself as a sort of diagram, and certainly then the algorithm being another kind of a diagram, right? MCM prime would be kind of that's a diagram, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense in which Deleuze and Guattari are using diagram, they're going to make that into dimensions of a process or even phases, if you want. A tetrahedron, they got the fourfold of their own, the generative, transformative, diagrammatic, and what was the last one? I think it was a micropolitics section. But yeah, the diagram for them is going to be much more dynamic than we might think of in a layman's sense. The diagrammatic is going to be. I'll come back to this in a second because I don't want to get this wrong. Is it the programmatic, maybe?
Shit, if you don't remember, I definitely don't.
No, wait. Okay, so the generative component, the transformational component, the diagrammatic, and the machinic component. Okay. So the diagrammatic component is the study of abstract machines from the standpoint of semiotically unformed matters in relation to physically unformed matters. The diagram of the abstract machine. But the program is what they refer to in the machinic aspect, right? The study of the assemblages that effectuate abstract machines, simultaneously semiotizing matters of expression and physicalizing matters of content. That's what they refer to with the word program. We make tracings, we map the regimes, we diagram the abstract machines, and then we outline the program of assemblages. Little Deleuze and Guattari excursus for a moment.
Back to Simondon, and to kind of recapitulate here. So we have an emergent social power that gets progressively deposited in dead labor that expresses itself in terms of like machinery, algorithms, logistical networks. Living labor's capacity is extracted, formalized, deposited in this fixed apparatus of dead labor or capital, which then is confronting us or the next round or generation of living labor as if it was capital's own productive power. That goes to the appropriation. In Simondon's terms, the trans individual gets deposited in the technical milieu, which then confronts the next phase of individuation as an already giving constraint rather than as emergent potential. And I think this might be another way of articulating what the gradient or the terminology of the gradient that I mobilize in the book project. All of that goes back to the hylomorphic because the factory appears to be what's productive. The algorithm appears to be what's intelligent. The coordination appears to belong to the market itself. All of that going back to our nice capitalist apologist, Milton Friedman's little giddy miracle example, right?
He's basically just multiplied fetishism. He's just thrown fetishism. He's taken it away from the commodity form and just thrown it everywhere.
He isn't just missing this violence of abstraction. He's also misattributing the cooperative power and attributing it to the market mechanism, right? Which, again, hylomorphism. It's misrecognition of the social power of labor as capital's property, and then celebrating the theft as this miracle. I made this Leibnizian comment earlier because I thought that this fit very neatly here in the sense that Friedman's argument fits this Leibnizian kind of model where maximum compossibility, this pre-established harmony, each monad acting from its own internal principle rather, yet them all coordinating perfectly. Each monad would represent these, he gives the example of the miner and the lumberjack, right? They're all these little windowless monads operating discreetly for him, but directed by the invisible hand of the market that organizes it all as if it's some transcendent property. But it's really like this emergent capacity of labor itself, or you might even say matter if you wanted to draw in Simondon there, although I might be fucking that up a little bit. So the important aspect of this theodicy parallel is that inequality would be necessary for incentive, exploitation being necessary for growth, crisis necessary for creative destruction. So every suffering that capitalism generates is justified by having a positive function within the totality.
It's a sordid boon.
This will point to the kind of N+1 that I also mobilize pretty largely in the book. N+1 is kind of the key components of what I do in the book, because it's like there's this clash between the qualitative and the quantitative. I mean, Postone is kind of pointing to this too in different terms, right? When he's talking about the abstract labor hour and material wealth or use value, right? Because whatever heterogeneous labor or activity knowledge is all getting compressed into this singular universal hour, right? So all the qualitative difference gets put into a quantity, and you can't solve a qualitative problem with quantitative logic, if that makes sense. I think we even make this mistake, or we're trained to make this mistake as consumers. Like happiness, or I don't know, fulfillment or what have you, is a qualitative capacity. We're kind of told, oh, if you buy this, if you achieve this thing, then that will fulfill this qualitative thing that you're searching for, right? But that never happens because it can't, you know what I mean? You're trying to fix something that the logics are kind of incommensurable. The bridge to Postone here is that capitalism isn't coordinating free individuals. It's this self-moving temporal form dominating everyone. So it's not just the proletariat, but capitalists as well. The elegance Friedman is admiring is the surface of a much darker process, a system that perpetually accelerates while it's simultaneously consuming the ground that it runs on. You can see that emerging, I think, in the ecological crisis, right? Because, again, we have to squeeze more product. We're expending more material. All right, productivity is increasing. That is implying that we're expending resources, whether that be labor resources or material resources, at a faster rate over time because of the increased productivity that gets compressed into the hour. So the amount of extraction and consumption that has to take place also goes up. Not only are we working harder to produce less, in a sense, less value, I guess, because the ratio of dead labor to living labor is constantly going up on the dead labor side. So the debt that we owe to dead labor is always increasing, and it might even be increasing at an exponential scale, while living labor can only service that debt on a linear scale.
Yeah, and I think that is something that Postone says in his own way, right? He's kind of showing that these two scales are not commensurable. And
because it's like, I was also thinking about this in terms of, like I said at the beginning, it's like the problem isn't scarcity, the problem is surplus, it's overproduction. And if you think about this practically, and I think I even have some numbers here, I don't know if we'll get to that, but I'm thinking about clothing as the example that I come up with. Maybe that shows my own proclivities too much. So if I go into a store to buy clothes, all the clothes in the store have already been produced. Boycotting a store doesn't really work, right? It goes kind of to the idea that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, but I think in a different register than most people articulate that through, because the stuff that's been produced has already had its labor time extracted and its material components extracted. So whatever ecological damage or consumption was required to produce whatever good, by the time you get to the point of purchase, the damage is already done, so to speak. There's an interesting connection there to the notion of surplus and scarcity, because basically more is produced. That's not an uncommon discussion relative to, I think, food typically, because something like 30% of all food that gets produced is thrown away, but it's not limited to food production. There's lots of waste that goes on. I think luxury brands are a worse example in a sense that Burberry burns jackets, or because some of the scarcity aspect of the luxury brand is like if they gave the extra surplus coats away, it would deteriorate their scarcity, which is kind of like what drives the value proposition in quotes of the brand itself. So it would undermine its own mode of reproduction if it simply gave away this excess. So it gets destroyed. So it's kind of this twist on the Baudrillard excess. The next thing I want to work through is why Postone is breaking with traditional Marxism. His claim is the problem isn't that capitalists exploit workers. The problem is the value form structures all of social life around the expenditure of abstract labor time, and that structuring dominates everyone, including capitalists. As I've worked through, someone produces a more productive method. Temporarily, they produce more value per hour than everyone else in that marketplace because the social standard hasn't caught up to that innovation yet. The next step, everyone adopts the new method or is compelled to through market competition. That technological advantage is negated. Total value per hour falls back to baseline. The clock resets. Because the reset erases that advantage of the technical innovation, the only way to get ahead again is to innovate again. So the circuit of MCM prime, in a way, you can already see how this is reinforced here. That treadmill, as Postone refers to, restarts. Productivity always has to increase, even though that increase is neutralized at the level of value. What's important here is that dynamic emerges before you even get to surplus value or class struggle, because it's already within the commodity form itself. The mere fact that wealth is measured in abstract labor time is already generating this self-propelling logic of endless productivity increases. Even if a laborer were to receive full value, even if you eliminate all exploitation, this treadmill process would still operate because society is still structured by value as the form of wealth. Value rather than material wealth. And we can see this very clearly. We've created more wealth. We have more technology than has ever existed in the history of the world. And yet we always hear we can't afford to have universal health care or whatever social program, right? Because social programs don't yield a return on the investment. And if there's no return on investment, then capital can't reproduce itself. It's the structural problem of the way that things are organized that prevents, I guess, social welfare, right? Or like it's always kind of the degradation of the social welfare at the expense of the individual. So how that gets expressed in the world is like more and more debt, more and more risk is offloaded onto individuals. For example, student loan debt, the gig economy where there's no benefits. I'm trying to think of another example. But I think you can kind of begin to see how this kind of structural problem of the value form itself really is maybe the primary contradiction in capital. I take this idea of the treadmill Postone kind of articulates, and you can kind of see where the idea of the treadmill and the idea of the gradient that I discuss are kind of like, I don't know, coterminous, or there's like a similarity there. The treadmill is a synchronic. It's still essentially the synchronic, even though it does describe a temporal movement. At any given moment, the social standard is reconstituting itself anew. It's wiping clean the slate at the level of value determination. Materially, ecologically, psychically speaking, that slate is never wiped clean. The ecological debt, the psychical debt, the physical debt that we as laborers have to bear and capital gets a free rider on, that scale is never rebalanced. So it always accumulates on the side of capital. And again, it's like the individuals and the earth that bear the brunt of paying back that debt, so to speak. Factories don't disappear. CO2 doesn't leave the atmosphere. Going back to Marx's old example about like the loom workers, right? They don't get their life or their livelihoods back, right? It's interesting too that this is always displaced, even before like the gig economy or even student loans. The individual laborer always has to bear the costs associated with technological advancement. You have to be retrained or whatever. That cost is borne by you and not by society, even though like the social collectivity is what enabled that technological innovation that put you out of a job to be generated in the first place, right?
Obviously, this treadmill that he's describing that you've gone through is very reminiscent of the myth of Sisyphus, right? The treadmill could just as easily be the boulder that restarts, as though Sisyphus is moving slightly up the mountain each time, but the mountain gets longer in any case. The gradient gets steeper.
Exactly. Yeah. The gradient is pointing to the asymmetry between values' formal reset and matter's irreversible accumulation. Totality constrains through form, but the gradient constrains through weight, through what has already been done and what can't be undone. This is where we can connect to Bataille a little bit. The treadmill would be Bataille's blocked expenditure stated in Postone's terms, where each productivity increase should give us free time. If it only takes half as long to produce a coat, for example, the half of the hour should be available for expenditure. So think Bataille with leisure, festival, rest, anything besides production, but that abstract temporal constraint reconstitutes necessarily for the circuit to continue. Free time never gets discharged. It just gets recaptured as new production time because that social standard resets and the same hour has to produce twice as much to count as an hour of value. The surplus time that productivity creates is immediately rebound to the circuit. Nothing is spent, everything is reinvested. Here's where I think you can see the parallel to deterritorialization, reterritorialization. So you have like that incremental or that moment where there is a sort of line of flight, so to speak. Maybe not line of flight, but there's a deterritorialization where for a time, maybe it's simultaneous. I don't know that they occur, but there's a moment where there's a genuine new innovation that occurs, and that innovation is real, but then it's subsequently captured.
Yeah, the line of flight is blocked. There is and should be some flight, but its line is blocked. It's part of the black hole effects that they describe, throughout the strata, if you will. Because that's another way of understanding stratification in 1,000 Plateaus is the way in which the strata are also black holes, cutting off escapes.
That's kind of something we work through in the book too, with respect to what happens, I think, and you can kind of see this parallel with stellar black holes, is that the mass grows so large that it works space-time and even light can't escape.
Information, light, in its distortion of time too, right?
Ooh, good. Yeah.
So not only light, but information itself too. This is the semiotic and physical that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about with abstract machines.
Because I was thinking about this in the sense of dead labor accumulates such a mass that no line of flight nothing can escape it because nothing moves fast enough. So line of flights do emerge, but they can't emerge at a speed that's fast enough to escape the trajectory of the reterritorialization, the acceleration of productivity, whenever that's been going on for hundreds of years, right? Like that cycle it has to get faster and faster to keep the system going. We always have to be producing more to get the same thing. You can see this in a very practical example in the way that maybe your parents could buy a house or attend college without taking out loans, or at least the costs were way less. Housing prices were like maybe half of what they are today, right? But just to have that same quality of life, you have to take on so much more risk. You can't just go get a factory job. You have to go to college. You have to take on student loan debt, etc., just to be able to reach the sort of quality of life that they had. Not only that, but you're more productive. Collectively, we're more productive, but we have to effectively work harder. We have to be twice as productive to reach the same sort of floor, because that floor is always resetting, as I just was talking about a moment ago, the way that the loom works. It should free up another half hour, but it doesn't, because we're still stuck in the value form, the abstract labor hour.
The machinic, unconscious abstract labor hour.
Postone shows us the specific mechanism where capital ensures that surplus is never genuinely expended. The abstract temporal constraint absorbs any productivity gain and reconstitutes scarcity at the next level. The treadmill is the value form's answer to the general economy's demand for expenditure. Defer, defer, defer. Looking at pre-capitalist societies, they had technologies of discharge that manifested as like a potlatch, jubilees, the Sabbath festival, and these all ensured that surplus was genuinely spent rather than reinvested. So the coding of flows in Deleuze and Guattari's sense regulated expenditure, specific qualitative obligations ensuring that surplus circulated rather than accumulated. That's the destruction that occurred in the potlatch prevented accumulation.
The Jubilee is a great example of wiping debts, right? Clean slate.
Because they were, what's the phrasing? They were like terrified. They wanted to ward off the decoded flows.
Yes, warding off the nightmare of capitalism, but specifically decoded flows. When Deleuze and Guattari are when they're looking through filiation and alliance in the beginning of chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus, it's precisely so that they can tie in their analyses with when Marx is talking about, money begetting money. When money becomes filiative, that's when you start to have capital proper, right? That's the self-valorizing value that Marx's term Postone takes it up and uses it all throughout. That goes into their other argument about the combination, the meeting, the conjunction of the decoded flows of money and the deterritorialized flows of labor, right? When the worker becomes free in the double sense that Marx means, that's the other moment of capitalism's like birth. Because the question that Fernand Braudel keeps asking, why capitalism here and then and not, earlier and not elsewhere? To connect MCM prime directly to decoded flows, to a certain extent, MCM prime, because of the prime, is presupposing, in a certain extent, this movement of flows becoming decoded, right? And
maybe it is just money becoming affiliative. That points to the same general thing that at least I was thinking about in terms of drawing the connection between MCM prime and the decoded flows.
So the abstract general equivalent takes on a life of its own. Hegel himself was already speaking in a way that, Marx pretty much takes it, the self-valorizing value of the self-moving. He gets that from Hegel when Hegel's talking about money. It's the self-moving life of what is dead, right? That's one way of
which goes to dead,
translating it.
Dead labor, yes. Right? I can't believe it was illegible to me, but I was thinking about MCM prime itself was a very Hegelian moment.
Yeah.
The dialectic, but without a sublation.
I suppose the prime is something of a sublation, but it's at least in this very sense in which, for Hegel, the spiral is a mono circle. It is part of a treadmill if you just think of it in a different type of torsion, right? You end up on a higher level, but it's the same circle. It's the same mill. The tread is steepened, right?
The gradient has steepened. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Back to the flows and the codes. The capitalist axiomatic replaced the codes with this abstract temporal constant, the abstract labor hour, which converts every form of free time into raw material for the next cycle of accumulation. Where you can really sharpen this critique or this idea is in the sense of social media platforms. And I'll get to this later on too. It's like even our free time, which escaped this circuit, now is incorporated because we give our free time to social media platforms. a joke that I might have told you in person now becomes content which can be monetized by a platform. My vacation to Machu Picchu, like I go to Machu Picchu, I take my photograph, that like qualitative moment becomes part of this quantitative process. And then, I mean, that even gets to something more dark and hyper real there, but I'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later. One critical point that I want to bring to bear here is, to me, this is the most difficult part of the antagonism of capital itself, is that it can tolerate any form of destruction, war, financial crisis, pandemics, as long as that destruction contributes to the next cycle. Creative destruction being the system's native mode of self-renewal. What it can't tolerate is genuine expenditure without return. So that would be something like social programs or festivals or even Jubilee, like those kind of like primitive territorial activities that we discussed. The Sabbath. The treadmill can metabolize catastrophe, but it can't metabolize actual free time. The gradient measure is not how much a civilization has suffered, but how much expenditure it has been preventing from making. Postone's specific contribution here is the blockage isn't imposed by the ruling class hoarding surplus. It's built into the commodity form itself. Even if workers receive the full value of labor, even if exploitation are eliminated, the same treadmill would still reconstitute as a necessity at each new level of productivity. The block discharge here is structural, not distributive, so that's why you can't redistribute your way out of it. It's the temporal form. That's where the domination occurs, right? Because the title of the book, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, the social domination is temporal, primarily. Yes, capital creates a proletariat class and a capitalist class, but that's like an epiphenomenon of the value form. So it's not the primary thing. Capital is the subject of history, and labor is the proletariat's the object of history. By the structural format, the object of history can't become the subject. It can't become the revolutionary subject because it's literally the object, if that makes sense. Capitalism makes labor the object of history and makes itself the subject of history.
He had that long footnote disagreeing with Lukács. Said, Lukács is like reading Marx and arguing that proletariat becomes the subject of history by realizing that capitalism is what objectifies their labor and turns their labor power into objects, and therefore the laborer himself or herself. Postone, trying to show that Lukács is doing a strong reading of Marx, but by offering a different reading is saying, no, in fact, the proletariat can't be the subject of history precisely because, and the outcome of on the way to communism, the proletariat abolishes itself.
Here's where I was going to go with respect to like Machu Picchu, but I think the underlying theoretical move here would point to Marx's fragment on machines and even machine and structure for Guattari. I was talking about going to Machu Picchu, content becoming raw material for the platform's extraction circuit. So your attention, your audience's attention converted to the data is sold to an advertising company, advertising revenue feeds back into MCM Prime. You perform this form of leisure while producing surplus value for the platform. The most insidious part is the experience was already captured before you arrived because the platform formatted your desire in advance. You didn't go to spend your surplus. You went to produce an image of spending your surplus, and the image is the commodity. So very Baudrillardian there. So back to Hegel, I was thinking that the MCM Prime circuit reminded me a lot of, or the way that he being Postone was talking about this reminded me of Spirit. His line from page 291, capital must accumulate constantly in order to exist. Becoming is the condition of its being. For Hegel, spirit externalizing itself into nature, traversing otherness, and returns enriched incorporating and preserving what had been encountered. The concrete moment being sublated, negated, preserved, elevated. But in MCM prime, what happens to C? It isn't preserved. It's consumed, used up, and discarded. Labor is expended. Raw materials are transformed. Bodies are aged. M isn't M enriched by having incorporated C. It's M that has extracted from C and left residue behind. So the concrete moment doesn't get elevated, it gets destroyed. I have 4 registers of the same circuit that I'm going to run through. The first being Hegelian, a circuit without alpha bung, the concrete being consumed, not sublated. 2, Deleuze Guattari, a deterritorialization that's immediately reterritorialized on the value axiomatic. M to C deterritorializes, C to M recaptures. 3, Bataille, the sacrificial circuit is blocked, the expenditure moment C being traversed but not honored, the concrete being consumed instrumentally rather than genuinely sacrificed, nothing being given up because the prime ensures that more comes back than went out. It's a sacrifice that refuses to sacrifice. Last one is the psychoanalytic register. A petite mort that never actually dies, the circuit that should resolve instead compounds, and because that abstract pole always returns augmented while the concrete pole gets left depleted. Moving from that to our conceptual mode of the petite mort A, the prime in MCM prime is structurally objet petit a, the temporary surplus value that each productivity increase generates before that social standard reabsorbs it is the surplus cause of desire that motivates the circuit, but that can't ever be possessed. So the moment that it's grasped, generalized, absorbed into the new baseline, it vanishes and the compulsion repeats. Every capitalist chases the surplus that will dissipate the moment it's achieved. Lacan's point being objet A is not the desired object, but the cause of desire, that structural gap that keeps desire moving. You don't desire the surplus is actually what makes you desire. And I think that transductive spin on Lacan is really awesome. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I mean, and that's why the prime is so important in MCM prime, right? If it's just MCM without the prime, obviously we don't have the surplus. And so we're just, it'd be like paying ourselves for something we already have, right? You got to have the prime. It primes the circuit, if you will. This is another way of punning on what the prime is.
MCM prime being driven by petite a, the surplus cause that motivates but is never attained, enacting petite mort, the traversal of C, the concrete consumed, the little death of the commodity moment, but never achieving genuine death. So no alpha bung, no discharge, no resolution. It's the death drive that can't die. It's the repetition compulsion without catharsis. The jouissance of surplus is what's forbidden, and that's what sustains the surplus. We call that convergence petite mort a. I thought this was kind of an interesting mobilization of Nachtraglichkeit, where the surplus is constitutively prior, like I was referring to with the loans and the Federal Reserve or central banking, where the loan is what precedes the experience, like the phenomenological experience of debt, and the credit creation preceding scarcity. So first there's too much money being lent out, but at the individual level, now that I've taken out a loan, I do experience that as phenomenological lack, because now I don't have the money on me right now to repay that loan. Lack, it only emerges in this retroactive way, right? Because we first have surplus and then we have lack. What do you think about that?
The after effect, the aftermath, what is it? How does Strachey translate it? He sometimes uses the word deferred. You brought that up earlier. I think deferred action, obviously Lacan will call it après coup, which we could literally translate as like after blow. I do think that we can see that in everything we've been talking about, especially in Postone's analysis of the different forms of time, the treadmill effect that we've been discussing, and the way you're talking about it in terms of credit and debt is interesting in terms of, obviously, I think that is a symptom or a constitutive feature, really, of what we've been describing as petit mora, right? This cause, the causality. You might want to, like, to speak in your terms, you might want to think about a Nachtraglichkeit as this last instance type deal. I know at some point.
Oh, that's interesting, right? That definitely fits in my understanding of last instance, because there's the historical component and then the instantiation of the thing, like the contingent instantiation of the determination itself in the temporal sense, right? I'll walk you through this objet a, this kind of transductive reading of objet a that I think is pretty clever and good. And wasn't even quite thinking. I was kind of thinking along these lines in the manuscript, but this really sharpened it. I think this notion of surplus being ontologically prior, I hadn't wrestled with. I was working around it, but it didn't really hit home until this morning. So the object cause of desire is constitutively surplus. It's the excess that the symbolic order can't capture, the remainder that escapes signification. But it functions by producing the experience phenomenologically at the subject level as lack. It's not that you lack because something is missing, you lack because something is excessive. And the excess is what opens a gap in the symbolic that you experience as a wanting. The standard misreading would be ontological lack as primary. That itself is the Nachtraglichkeit, the surplus retroactively constituted as deficiency because it can only appear from within the structure it generates as something you don't have. And this goes to that moment, the Simondonian shit that I was texting you earlier, right? Because at the level of the pre-individual, there's excess. The individual emerges from a pre-individual, a supersaturated solution, temporarily speaking, and this maybe would go to your last instance point, where the instantiation of the individuated being, looking back, whenever they look back at the pre-individual, the excess, it appears as lack, right?
Yeah, you take the crystal out of the mother liquor, the supersaturated solution, and the always more is now felt as something lacking to the crystal that's been taken out.
Yeah, so it'd be like, I mean, if you want to look at the Oedipus complex too, right? It's kind of like the child is taken out of the mother, and then because the child has been taken out of the mother, now it owes this debt to the mother for its sustenance. And that's where all the fucking guilt, the circuit of guilt and what have you that Freud postulates emerges.
Well, and you remember Lacan calls lamella, that's the kind of monstrous phantasmatic remainder.
So again, asserting the pre-individual field as a supersaturation. It's also a metastable system charged with more energy than the current structure can contain. It carries incompatible potentials that can only resolve through individuations. And that's the fundamental condition of reality at every scale. Physically, biologically, psychically, collectively, individuation only happens because there's too much, not because something is missing. The charge system has to discharge, and every individuation is partial. So the pre-individual is never exhausted, and a remainder of unresolved potential persists as associated milieu available for additional individuation. And what's interesting is you can see the way that MCM prime expresses that same process.
I can see why you're immediately relating this. So at the microphysical level, Simondon is elaborating with the example of the crystal and the mother liquor in the supersaturated solution. There's similar arguments going on, and obviously a different problematic, but on the macrophysical level, this is where Bataille starts with the sun and the energy that is wasted, as he calls it.
At every scale, you can kind of see where there is that same Nachtraglichkeit operation of the phenomenological experience of deprivation being generated by excess because of the debt angle. And this is where I think really sharpens a lot of the work that we're trying to do in the manuscript, because the accumulated debt of dead labor, right? In the sense of, let's say, infrastructure. So dead labor accumulates. We might even speculatively say that dead labor accumulates on an exponential level, and that living labor can only service debt in a linear way. The debt always gets bigger, but living labor can only service so much of that debt. It can't ever fully resolve the debt that's owed. Every generation is born into a situation where more debt is owed than the previous generation. Think about this pragmatically in the sense of just infrastructure, right, that has to be maintained. So machines, bridges, technological systems, all of that infrastructure that already precedes us requires that we labor, and actually requires that we labor more because we have more responsibility to maintain the infrastructure that generated us in the first place. That goes to the steepening of the gradient, that goes to the treadmill. I mean, that might have been one of the fundamental things I was thinking about in terms of dead labor whenever the book stuff emerged.
And it was interesting to see that Postone only says treadmill 11 times in the whole book, but it does crystallize, to stick with our examples, it crystallizes the idea quite well.
Desire transversely read is not the metonymy of lack, but the operation of excess seeking resolution. The individuated being desires because the field from which it precipitated carried more potential than any single individuation could resolve. The dead labor debt that we owed is greater than any single individual could ever pay back. There was never anything lost. Something persists that exceeds the form it generated. And that is kind of a universal ontological thing or challenge, perhaps, right? So I think we're going to try to finish up because we have too much material. We have an excess, ironically. Mm-hmm. But I do want to finish up on hyperreality because I think it's really interesting that, to me, Postone kind of gave, again, some really strong theoretical, philosophical grounding to Baudrillard's more kind of flying by the seat of his pants theorization. Hyperreality would be the same kind of surplus that we've been discussing, but it's at the semiotic register. So again, hyperreality is not a lack of reality, but it's experienced phenomenologically as a lack of reality, but it's really the creation of too much reality. And it all ties back to the fact that materially and semiologically in a same register, the abstract hour is absorbing more and more production, but itself is never changing. It remains the hour, but it's what the hour represents is immensely different, right? Like what a labor hour in 1850 represented in terms of material, time, resources, bodies, etc., and what a current hour of labor time is are vastly different things, right? Like the intensity has gone up. That kind of goes to Baudrillard's example in Simulacra and Simulation of the map exceeding the territory. Again, that's the phenomenological form of what Postone refers to as the treadmill at this point where the gap between material wealth and value becomes experientially overwhelming. The world feels hyperreal, oversaturated, excessive, simultaneously too much, but also meaningless because the concrete dimension of production has so far outstripped that abstract dimension's capacity to give it legibility. Everything is produced and nothing registers. That's the lived experience of that constant abstract labor hour absorbing more than it can ever represent. And the accursed share is the same surplus from the expenditure register. Bataille's accursed share is the surplus that the restricted economy can absorb, energy that exceeds what the system needs for maintenance and must be expended without return. Under general economy, that surplus gets burned off through potlatch, festival, sacred destruction that discharges the excess and resets that symbolic field. Under capital, expenditure is blocked. MCM prime recaptures everything as accumulation. the occur share doesn't get burned off, it piles up. So too much reality piles up and becomes experienced as lack of reality, which really is fascinating going back to Nachtraglichkeit and supersaturation of the pre-individual field. The fact that surplus gets experienced as a lack, I think that's really fascinating. And it really hadn't hit home until I was kind of working through Bataille here. Overproduction, hyperreality, and their occur share are the same unburned surplus viewed from the economic, semiotic, and expenditure angles, respectively. The gradient is what the surplus becomes when it accumulates across generations without discharge. It produces a surplus of reality that it can't metabolize, a weight of accumulated matter that it can't see, and an occur share that it can't burn. That surplus, which is individual to the value form but real at every other register, is the gradient steepening towards whatever comes after the system's integrative capacity gets exceeded. Going back to Deleuze Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, the three territorial machines, the primitive territorial machine, the despotic machine, the capitalist machine, which don't represent a linear evolution from simple to complex. They are different regimes of coding, overcoding, and decoding, different ways of organizing flows of production, desire, and expenditure. Every one metabolizes the previous one's disruption and reorganizes at a higher level of complexity. In so doing, they integrate residue that can't be undone. In the primitive territorial machine, the sign is the thing. The system of cruelty codes flows directly onto bodies, scarification, initiation rituals, etc. It's already an abstraction, but a code that's still tethered to actual flesh, territory, or the earth. Debt circulates, but it also discharges. The potlatch burns real wealth. The scarification ritual draws actual blood. The expenditure is abstract in its function, so prestige, status, symbolic equilibrium, but it's concrete in its actual medium, so destruction that actually destroys, sacrifice that actually sacrifices. That allows the territorial machine to flatten its gradient because discharges are actually real. That kind of maps on to Baudrillard's first stage, where the sign is a reflection of a basic reality. Inscription and referent are one. The mark on the body is the debt. In the despotic machine, the sign masks and perverts reality. The despot overcodes the territorial machine by introducing its transcendent signifier in the form of the God King, the law, the infinite creditor. Debt becomes detached from the body and attaches to the abstract authority of the sovereign, let's say. Debt can't be discharged through finite expenditure because the creditor is infinite. That's the first capture of expenditure by accumulation, the moment where sacrificial economy starts to become blocked. But the code is still legible. You know exactly who you owe and why you owe. This ties to Baudrillard's second stage, where the sign masks and perverts a basic reality. The despot's law claims to represent the territorial debt, but it's replaced it with something incommensurable by infinite obligation dressed as ancestral continuity. Third machine, the capitalist machine. The sign masks the absence of reality. Capital decodes both of the prior territorial machines. No transcendent signifier, no bodily inscription, just the axiomatic of value. That axiomatic doesn't actually need to mean anything. It just needs to flow and accumulate. The constant hour claims to measure labor, but the connection between the abstract measure and that concrete content is increasingly fictive. Again, so more and more productivity, more material production and extraction, etc., accumulates over time, but it's still within the same temporal structure that remains constant. The non-constant hidden inside the constant, the hour absorbing ever denser concrete reality, but it presents itself as unchanged. So what this means is the value form measures the concrete labor hour disappearing beneath it. That ties to Baudrillard's third stage, where the sign masks the absence of a basic reality. Value still refers to labor, but labor as a source of material wealth is starting to become irrelevant. The sign persists while its referent drains away slowly. Lastly, with late-stage capitalism, financialization, the sign has no relation to reality. We wind up with derivatives of derivatives, synthetic CDOs, algorithmic trading algorithms. pure simulation where value runs entirely on a self-referential logic. So that could also be something like ETFs for something like cryptocurrency. We can move on to Baudrillard's fourth stage, which is what this is. Pure simulation, the code circulating without referent, generating its own reality. Again, CDOs, credit default swaps that refer back to mortgages, which are already signs representing debt, representing physical property. You can see the layers of removal from like the material world that take on their own life. And in the crisis, the values of the derivatives became detached from the actual material value. So once mortgages started failing, people weren't unable to actually pay back their mortgages. It took a long time for that to actually register in the financial instruments themselves. Just to give you a concrete example of how that actually functions. But I think we can wrap up there. Unless you have, if you have something you want to recapitulate at the end here, please feel free.
I'm glad that we read Postone and that it was able to connect in the specifically Marxist subsoil of like the project. You know, it was a good stand-in for Marx. And one of the good things too in these chapters that we read for today, he is very scholarly in the sense in which he's pointing to particular pages of, I believe it's the Brewster translation of Volume 1 of Capital, the one that is accessible like in the Penguin edition, I believe. And so he makes a lot of very nuanced like readings he's doing. He's also like, go look at this page of Capital, which helps because there's even the first volume is obviously quite long. And so it's kind of nice that these chapters as a reference have dozens of other references back to OG Marx. That means that it can be a resource for us in the future as we flesh out some of the references that we want to include.
All right. Well, that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happier. We'll see you all next time.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.